Smoothing out a rough relationship with an ex? The US tried that. Up next on Welcome to Learning with Sprayberry, where we try to make social studies fun, easy, and educational. Today, we're looking at a treaty that was designed to heal some of the issues between the United States and Britain right after the Revolutionary War. Think of this kind of as a scenario where you have two exes fighting, except refusing to return each other's calls with shooting at each other until finally giving up and ignoring each other. Yeah, I guess that scenario works as well as any other. Anyway, back to what we're talking about. Before we can get too deep into the topic, we've got to give ourselves some context so that we know what we're talking about. I'm going to hit you with some background right about now. About 10 years after the Revolutionary War was wrapped up with the Treaty of Paris, another war breaks out. This time, thankfully, we weren't involved. The war is between France, Great Britain, and a few other European countries. You see, France was going through its own revolution to remove its monarchs, and this revolutionary idea was starting to spread. Many other European countries were not down with that, so naturally, some conflict is going to emerge. I'm sure you're about to ask what all of that has to do with the United States. Well, we decided a while back to try and maintain neutrality. This was one of those major tenets of Washington's foreign policy. Basically, we were going to stay out of anyone else's business so that we don't get drug into problems. And as a new fledgling country, we had to ensure that we could trade with the wider world around us. Getting wrapped up in war is bad for trade. It's hard to trade with people when you're just as likely to have to shoot them. Unfortunately, most of our trading partners were busy shooting at each other. So if we traded with one country, say France, we risked upsetting another country, say England. And the opposite is true as well. England wanted to improve its relationships with the United States to, help ensure that we wouldn't side with the French. The US also wanted to improve trade relations with England because we badly needed their products. But we also hope to get some of the leftover nagging issues of the Revolutionary War out of the way. When discussing trade, it's important to understand that as a nation, we were plentiful in raw materials, but much less so in finished materials. We exported many raw products to other European countries, but we imported finished goods from them. However, our trade with England was, very one-sided. We imported many finished goods, but the exports we tried to send back were often blocked from British ports, or those that made it through were heavily taxed by tariffs. This does not make trading with England very profitable for our country. We're spending more money on other countries than we are getting from them. Additionally, there's several issues left over from the Revolutionary War that need to be settled. For example, there were British soldiers still stationed in the Northwest Territory, which violates the Treaty of Paris. Part of the treaty required British soldiers to vacate all land belonging to the United States. England claimed that they maintained these areas due to the lack of American repayment of war debts. Further upsetting this relationship was the fact that England and the US still hadn't nailed down the border between the US and Canada. England was also impressing American sailors into their war against France. In reality, this was just a reason to be upset because many of our sailors were actually expatriates from England trying to make money and not get drug into the Napoleonic wars that they were still dealing with. But they're American now, and we protect our own. Now, looking at this, you would assume that the treaty would be a no-brainer. Let's set up some trade policies, fix the issues from the war, and call it a day. But like most things, it ain't gonna be that easy. There were parts of America that were seriously pushing the other way, towards France. You see, France had helped us in the revolution against England, so why would we be so gung-ho to sign a treaty with a former enemy? The calls for French support came from pretty high up in the government, especially from Thomas Jefferson, who had spent 5 years in France as a US ambassador. However, others felt we should side with England because of our similar background, culture, and values. These voices were championed by Alexander Hamilton and ultimately Washington, who sided with Hamilton. With all these issues having been around for the better part of a decade, what finally set off negotiations? England had captured close to 300 American ships that were trading with France, many of whose sailors were impressed into British service. Obviously, this angered Americans, many of which, especially the Democratic Republicans, called for war against England. Others, like James Madison, sought a more diplomatic method to stop British action. Madison proposed a trade embargo against England. Furthering the disputes between the U.S. and England was the fact that England increased the trading of weapons with Native Americans in the Northwest Territory. The natives were using the weapons to push back against American expansion into the region. So we've got to smooth things out so England stops stealing our stuff and soldiers, plus we've got to convince them to stop giving weapons to Native Americans to use against us. In response to these actions, Washington sent John Jay to try and negotiate a treaty with England. Hamilton pushed for a treaty that increased trade while smoothing over relations. The negotiations were not in America's favor. We couldn't back up any threats, and we didn't have a lot that England wanted. The only real threat that we could throw down was if the U.S. would side with Denmark and Sweden. This means that we would defend our neutrality by attacking any ships that attacked us. This would have meant attacking British ships who were stopping our ships and impressing our sailors. We wouldn't go on the offensive, but we would play heavy defense. Ultimately, we didn't want to do this. Shooting at people tends to negate your "I'm neutral" argument. Besides, this threat was hampered when Hamilton specifically told England that we had no desire to side with Denmark or Sweden. Eventually, a treaty is hashed out between the U.S. and England. The official name of the treaty is the Treaty of Amity, Commerce, and Navigation between His Britannic Majesty and the United States of America. Now, this treaty did help us in a few ways, but it also gave some things to the British. Britain agreed to pay the $11.6 million in damages for all the stopped shipping, while the U.S. agreed to pay £600,000 for Revolutionary War debt. Not sure why we couldn't just call it a wash and whoever owed more money just pay the difference, but hey, I teach social studies, not economics. I mean, economics is part of social studies, but whatever. England finally agreed to remove all of its soldiers from forts in the Northwest Territory, and a border between Canada and the U.S. was to be formally established by a joint committee of both countries. This border wasn't locked down until after the War of 1812, which, spoilers, was between the U.S. and Great Britain. For more information on that, check out my 3-part series on that. Additionally, the U.S. was granted the title of Most Favored Nation by the British, and this amounts to about as much as when you promise to be somebody's best friend in elementary school in return for some of their chips. Yeah, it doesn't really do anything. Before we get into why all of this matters, if you found this video helpful, educational, or frankly just enjoyable, do me a favor and take a second to click that subscribe button. It takes just a second, doesn't cost you anything, and can help out a small creator like me. Why do we still talk about this treaty centuries later? There's a few reasons that it still resonates. First of all, this treaty was not popular with Americans. Many felt that we simply let the British off the hook for any hostile actions. They felt that we gave away too much in negotiations. This treaty also helped push our country towards the two-party system that we enjoy today. Because this treaty was so unpopular, the Democratic Republicans, headed by Thomas Jefferson, were given plenty of ammunition to use against the Federalists. The Democratic Republicans had sought to side with the French because it was felt that siding with England was in direct opposition to everything that we had fought for in the war. After all, we would be signing a treaty with the monarchy, that thing we got rid of. The Democratic Republicans painted this treaty as a betrayal to American values. If you think American politics are bad now, you should see how they held rallies back then. Many opponents of the treaty, John Jay, and the Federalist Party would gather after the treaty passed, shouting, "John Jay, everyone that won't John Jay, everyone that won't put lights in his window and sit up all night John Jay." Obviously, this treaty strained our relationship with France as well. Many of them also saw this treaty as a betrayal of the relationship built up during the Revolutionary War. With everything that England has done to the U.S., how do you think we should have handled negotiations? Did we give up too much, or, given our standing in the world, did it go as well as can be expected? Let me know what you think down in the comments below. Alright, thanks for watching Learning with Sprayberry, where we do our absolute best to make social studies fun, easy, and educational. Again, if you like this video, hit the like button. If you want to see more, hit subscribe and ring the bell and do all that stuff. Until next time, I'll see you later. That bird is annoying. Chirp, 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 chirp. Britain agreed. I'm currently watching a wasp stuck in my house, so that's awesome. That bee is stuck in my house. I don't like bees.